Good morning. My name is Edward Sanshin Oberholtzer. I'm the resident priest at the Joseph Priestley Zen Sangha. We're an affiliate of Empty Moon Zen. 75 years ago today, people in Nagasaki, Japan were waking up, thankful that they had been spared the unimaginable fate of their fellow countrymen in Hiroshima just 2 days prior, not realizing what that fate had in store for them on the next day. And so, on a day like this, on an anniversary like this, closing in on the Japanese celebration of Obon, a time when we remember our ancestors, on this day, I think it appropriate that we begin with the Gata of Atonement. In the translation used by the San Francisco Zen Center, it goes, "All my ancient twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow." I like that. Ancient and twisted karma. And doesn't this describe the world we find ourselves in? Confused threads, ancient threads, tangled, chaotic, hard to trace, sometimes hard to face. So let me retell a story ancient and twisted, a story from the Upaya Kausala Sutta, an early Mahayana sutra. Early, ancient, twisted. Once, countless eons ago, in a much earlier life, the Buddha was the captain of a trading vessel, sailing home from a successful voyage with 500 happy and satisfied merchants, and with all of their profits on board. There was also a passenger whose murderous intent was directed at those merchants, who intended to kill them all in their sleep and seize all of that bounty for himself. The plan was revealed to the Buddha in his sleep, and he was left to ponder what to do with this. He could simply let events unfold, but the end result would be not simply that 500 merchants would die, but that the murderer himself would spend thousands of eons in hell for his crime. But should the Buddha tell the merchants? They would set upon the potential killer, slay him, and then themselves spend countless eons in hell. The Buddha saw only one way to resolve this. He took a spear and he killed the passenger himself, knowing that a seeming eternity in hell awaited him. And this is our life. Tragedy consists of often facing nothing but bad choices, and yet having to act. We all have to act. We all have to choose, and in choosing, we all have to accept the consequences of those acts, no matter who we are. Bai Zhang famously saved a fox with the turning words, "Even a fully enlightened being is subject to the law of cause and effect." So thousands, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children died in that initial attack on those two unsuspecting Japanese cities, with effects and casualties lingering on for decades. And so the war ended. And with the surrender, the Japanese homeland was spared the devastation of a conquest which, given the recent events of the prior invasion of Okinawa, where over 100,000 civilians died, either in combat or through suicide, would have been devastating both for the soldiers on both sides, but especially for the civilian population. Karma ripples out like wavelets from a pebble tossed into a pond and touches us in ways we often don't suspect. My father dropped out of high school in the middle of World War II and attempted to join the army. When they rejected him as being too scrawny, he went next door and joined the Marines, who seemed more accommodating. He spent the war in the South Pacific as the tail gunner in a dive bomber. My stepfather left college and was commissioned in the Marines. He was assigned to the division that was going to be sent in on the first wave of the invasion of the Japanese home islands. But for the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but for the immediate deaths of close to 200,000 civilians, the war might well have lasted for years. My father might have flown missions over Japan. My stepfather might have landed on what would have been the fiercely defended beaches of the Japanese islands. One or the other or both might have died, and in that case, I might well never have been born. Hundreds of thousands of other Japanese soldiers and civilians might not have lived. The course of history would have been altered in ways we cannot imagine. But surely the course of history was altered in that blinding flash. David Loy asked the question of whether we shouldn't talk of a kind of collective karma. And so it seems the causes and conditions of those crewmen at the U.S. Air Base at Tinian, of those physicists in the Manhattan Project, those have spread out, enveloping all of us. My mother's favorite cousin finished his PhD in physics at Los Alamos, working on the first test bomb. His children's birth certificates all list a post office box in Los Alamos as their birthplaces. A good and decent man, he worked with Robert Oppenheimer, who, watching the first nuclear blast at the Trinity site near Los Alamos, reached out for the words of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And our world was destroyed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at that last judgment. A new world born of the deaths of all those innocent men, women, and children. That ancient, twisted karma reaches out and envelops us. How many of us grew up in the 50s in the shadow of nuclear holocaust, who crouched, as we now know fruitlessly, under school desks as sirens wailed? How many awaited Armageddon, listening to reports coming in over network television about the Cuban Missile Crisis? These were the direct descendants of that first week in August 1945. The consequences of those fateful bombs. The threads of that unfolding karma have touched not simply our lives, but the course of our nation and of the world right down to the present day. Just ask anyone in Hawaii who woke up last year to the news that a Korean missile was incoming. False though that might have been. And let us also remember the other deaths, the far greater numbers of civilian deaths in the fire bombings of Tokyo, the unimaginable suffering of the people of China, the rape of Nanjing, the oppression of the Koreans and the Manchurians. But on this day, it all comes down to those men, women, and children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dead, the injured, those lingering on with the after effects of radiation poisoning, some simply left as shadows burned onto walls. All my ancient twisted karma, I now fully avow. May we remember, may we be at one. Thank you.